One of the reasons, of course, is to attend the International Religious Freedom Conference, which we did this morning. We got a spotlight with Speaker Pelosi on the freedom of religious belief, and also to do with reincarnation of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And then, of course, there was this book launch by Professor Lau. His Holiness is trying to seek a negotiated, peaceful, mutually beneficial solution for the Sino-Tibet conflict, which could be lasting. So the US government has played quite a role since 2002 to pass the Tibet Policy Act, and then there is the Tibet Support and Policy Act signed by President Trump into law. And then in 2024, we had the Resolve Tibet Act, because we changed our strategy a little bit. We were focused on the middle way, but then we started seeking acknowledgement for the historical status of Tibet as an independent state and the current situation of Tibet under the repressive Chinese government, a path called the middle path based on the Buddhist thinking. So when we say middle, there are ends to it. And if there is no recognition for the ends, then there is no value for middle way. So based on that, we have been working with the US government over the last, from 22 to 24, and got this Resolve Tibet Act passed. And Professor Lau's book, which is based on imperial Chinese historical records. And he's a Chinese scholar and proves that Tibet has never been considered a part of China by imperial Chinese records, if you can consider the Yuans, the Mongols, and the Manchus as Chinese dynasties. They have never considered Tibet as part of it. And there was also a legal perspective research done by Michael Van Wall Prague, which looks at Tibetan history from an international legal perspective and proves that Tibet has never been part of China. So these are some of the things we have been taking around the world, and also the issue of His Holiness reincarnation, where China is more concerned about the yet to come 15th Dalai Lama than the living 14th Dalai Lama. So we have to put our narrative on the world stage, I think, which we did quite well on His Holiness' 90th birthday last July, where we had some 218 media people from around the world in Dharamsala, and His Holiness made his statement, his position. Because China has three positions. One is that they will look for the 15th Dalai Lama within China, which means the communist government is ordering the Dalai Lama not to be reborn outside Tibet or China. And then the second position is the use of golden urn, which they say is a tradition. And my argument is there have been 8 Dalai Lamas before the golden urn, or the so-called golden urn, supposed to have been introduced in 1793, but there's no evidence of that. So China is have misused for the 11th Panchen Lama, for the selection of the 11th Panchen Lama, which they will do again for the next Dalai Lama also. So these are some of the things, narratives that we need to push into the international. The Resolve Tibet Act also talks about the historical status of Tibet, because China keeps saying Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. And the book by Professor Lau is also a personal revelation for him, because when he was going to a Chinese school, they were always taught that Tibet is part of China since antiquity. And when he reached university, he found that the communist government is asking every other government to say Tibet is part of PRC. So he wondered, what is the truth? So he went looking for that truth, and he found this, and he came out with a 1,300-page book, which are irrefutable evidence of Tibet not having been part of China.
And the middle way is not a new policy. It's a policy that His Holiness the Dalai Lama put forward many years ago. It's a policy that the government-in-exile has been pursuing. But I think the fundamental question to me is, has there been any progress? It doesn't seem like the Chinese government is responding.
From the time we came into exile in 1959, till about 1973, we asked for independence, because Tibet was an independent nation and we were seeking independence for Tibet. His Holiness was doing the same. Then around 1973-74, that was at the height of cultural revolution that was going on inside China, where everything was being destroyed. Then His Holiness thought about the survival, the existential problem of the Tibetans. So it is more important to preserve the Tibetan identity in form of language and culture and religion then seeking independence, because at that time, no countries were supporting Tibet. So since 1973, His Holiness started thinking about the middle way. Then there was Deng Xiaoping. He was a little more liberal. And he met with His Holiness' elder brother, Gyaltsen Thundrup, who died last year, and said, other than independence, we can discuss about everything. So we sent fact-finding delegations into Tibet in the early 80s. There were 2 exploratory teams to send in 82 and 84, whether some kind of negotiation is possible. There were leadership like Hu Yaobang, who were a little more liberal during those days. And then people started asking, what does His Holiness mean by middle way? So for the first time, His Holiness spoke about the 5-point peace proposal, starting by announcing Tibet as a natural reserve, or denuclearization, demilitarization, all that. The 5th point was on negotiation. So that was presented at the Human Rights Caucus of the US Congress those days. And this morning, Tom Lantos' daughter was there at the IRF, led by Tom Lantos and others in the US Congress. His Holiness presented that. And the subsequent year, in 1988, His Holiness expanded on the 5th point on negotiations. Then it remained like that for several years. We went through our process of deciding what should be the future course of for Tibetan people. We went through a sort of referendum. We didn't have to go through that. We went through a public opinion. Majority of the Tibetans said that based on the changes in international politics, China and Tibet, whatever His Holiness decides, we will follow that. And the Parliament also unanimously adopted that in 1997, and His Holiness reiterated his position on middle way. So we find nothing wrong with middle way. But if you look at the conflicts around the world, you wonder whether you are really resolving one problem or creating more problems for future. So what His Holiness is seeking is autonomy, willing to live within the framework of the Chinese Constitution. So that went on for 2002. There was some kind of approach from the Chinese government, and from 2002 to 2010, there were some rounds of dialogue, but essentially meant for China's coming out party, the Olympics. Once the Olympics was done, it stopped, in 2010. So around 2008, Chinese government asked, what do you mean by middle way? So we presented a paper to the Chinese government, a paper called Memorandum of Genuine Autonomy for the Tibetan People. Now, after the presentation of that paper, the Chinese government reached out to some 15 embassies and started putting their version of what had happened. And then we had to come out with an explanatory note to that. So those are all in writing. It went up to 2010. And since then, there have been no reach out from the Chinese side. I have mentioned about back channels since January 2023. We still send some people, but nothing of consequence. The whole idea is to explore whether there could be a renewal of contact and then maybe eventual negotiation. But if you look at the present Chinese leadership and their policies in the whole of China, and particularly in Tibet, the whole idea is if there are no nationalities, then there won't be nationality issues. So how do you make sure that there are no nationalities? You cannot kill all the Tibetans. So what they're doing is they're assimilating Tibetans into the Chinese culture and targeting our language, targeting our religion, our way of life, and of course, environment. So everything is aimed at destruction of Tibetan identity. So that is where we are trying to find a way through nonviolence, through negotiation. That could be mutually beneficial because Chinese are bereft of spiritualism for so many decades. And we are talking about more than 250 million Chinese Buddhists who look up to Tibet for spiritual inspiration. And His Holiness believes that we can fill that void for the Chinese people. And Tibetans can benefit economically, mutual beneficial solution. And that could be lasting. And this will also have a lot of geostrategic implications in the region. If the Sino-Tibet conflict is resolved, then India-China border issue also could be resolved because it's India-Tibet border. Even today, Indians call it Indo-Tibetan Border Police, Indo-Tibetan Border Force, not Indo-China border. That underlies Indian government's thinking because Tibet has always been the buffer between China and India over centuries, because to understand Tibetan history, you have to understand Tibetan geography also. because Tibet is called as the roof of the world. We call ourselves the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. It's the highest plateau and the biggest plateau on Earth. And Chinese environmental scientists today call Tibet the third pole because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. And then Tibet is also called as the water tower of Asia. So it has a lot of environmental, geostrategic, cultural implications, not only for the Tibetans, but for the whole world. So His Holiness believes in the idea of common prosperity, common benefit. He appreciates the concept of European Union. And then why not Tibet with China? Whether we like it or not, we cannot lift Tibet out of that place and put it somewhere in the Atlantic or the Pacific. So whenever we get to return back, we have to live in harmony with our neighbors, whether it's Chinese or Indians. And that's what we are trying to do, not asking for too much.